Welcome to Love and Guilt in the Anthropocene, a podcast to help people and organizations embrace the adventure of climate action. We are envisioning a world where sustainability comes naturally. This is from the blog post, Life is Hard. In your quest to make the world more sustainable, work on your empathy first. I'm Cassandra Thiel. Let's get going. A year and a half ago, a group approached me to ask if I would help them make green guidelines for in vitro fertilization or IVF treatment. My first question was, should we even have IVF? I mean, isn't the world already overpopulated? Why are we going through so much effort to make new babies, consuming all the resources for that medical care when there are so many kids who need to be adopted? That was my initial knee-jerk reaction. I stopped and gave myself time to process. I needed to think about the request itself, but I also really needed to think about how I responded to it. After all, choices, or the lack thereof, about reproduction exist within a long historical context, and overpopulation is a complex topic. A very brief example of carrying capacity. If you read my post about sustainability journeys, you will recall that I mentioned Isle Royale, the U.S. national park with the lowest annual attendance rate, but the highest visitor return rate. Well, this island has been home to a fascinating predator-prey study for nearly 70 years. This island is in the middle of Lake Superior. Occasionally, and less frequently these days, the lake would freeze enough to create an ice bridge between the main continent, usually Canada, and the island, allowing creatures like moose and wolves to journey to the island. Surprisingly, no other large game animals really came across. There are a few foxes, but mostly it's just the moose and the wolves. Since 1958, biologists have been studying the relationship between the moose and the wolves, counting every individual present on the island. Initially, their numbers seemed relatively stable, with about 500 moose and 20 wolves on the island. Then, after a series of mild winters, the moose population grew to over 1,000 animals. Soon thereafter, the wolf population grew too. With more wolves and the return of severe winter weather, the moose population dropped. This population dance might have continued in perpetuity, but humans, through a pet dog, introduced canine parvovirus, which decimated the wolf population. In just a couple of years, they went from 50 animals to about 10. In the relative absence of predators, the moose population exploded over the next decade, reaching a high of nearly 2,500 individuals. Then the worst happened. Given their numbers, food competition was fierce. There was an outbreak of ticks in the winter, and it was a severe winter to boot. The island saw nearly 1,500 moose perish in 1 year. That is carrying capacity. The moose population essentially grew too large for the amount of food available on the island. Disease spread more readily amongst the densely populated island. The result? A crash. My biologist dad had explained these concepts to me starting at a young age, and I became very concerned about the environment. I even started a neighborhood rainforest club, where mostly the neighborhood boy and I would just sit and draw pictures of rainforests full of various birds, animals, and bugs. I always had a feeling people, others, were bad or wrong, doing all these things to harm Mother Nature, things like having too many children. This narrative was reinforced at church, where one of the messages I received was that humans were superior to other beings. After all, Adam from Genesis was assigned as the caretaker over other animals in the garden. He was to name them and dominate them. Despite really sinking into my person, these messages irritated me to no end. First, it had always been clear to me that the animals around me could think, feel, and communicate just like I could, albeit in different ways. Second, if humans were so superior, I felt they ought to be able to control their own numbers. If we were becoming too many for the planet to handle and rushing toward a population crash, shouldn't we be superior enough to avoid it, without all the pain and suffering that would inevitably arise? A very brief history of reproductive decision-making. First, if it wasn't clear, we are talking about an amazing power: birth. It's the ultimate power in some ways, creating brand new human beings. This is a power that we haven't been able to really replicate outside of a living womb. We need people with uteruses to make this happen. How incredible! Who wouldn't try to control that? No, really, who hasn't tried to control that? Second, many people have an intense biological urge to reproduce. It's even part of the definition of what it means to be a living being. For some people, not reproducing a new life is akin to failing at your own life. Add to it that classical reproduction often involves sex, which is often perceived as dirty or wrong unless it's been blessed by the community and comes with some clear commitments. I was raised Catholic, so I still feel super awkward talking to my primary care doctor, obstetrician, and gynecologist about sexual health. Even though I've been married for 7 years and sex has officially transformed from sin into duty, according to the church, I still can't wrap my head around that. Every culture has its own ways of controlling the power of reproduction. Shame, regulation, customs, etc., etc. Beyond the collective morality slapped onto reproductive decision-making, there is a long history of horrible missteps by the state in controlling reproduction. Most people are familiar with China's one-child policy, implemented between 1979 and 2015. Though aiming to restrict the country's population growth, the policy had very devastating consequences for women, girls, families, and the economically disadvantaged. In the U.S. today, perinatal care is questionable in many states due to the overturning of the 1973 Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. Women are being denied necessary and life-saving medical care under the guise of saving babies. But those who advocate for anti-abortion regulations typically fail to understand why someone might seek an abortion. In doing so, they also harm women, girls, and families, just as China did during the one-child era. Sadly, China and the U.S. are definitely not alone in their coercive family planning policies. There are many issues with these coercive policies. Chief among them is fairness. Most of these laws are either inherently unfair or enforced unevenly, giving rise to issues of inequality. For example, most wealthy people will find ways to sidestep or avoid such regulations. In China, the wealthy could pay fines or bribes to have more than one child. In the U.S., the wealthy can travel to another state or country to receive the care they need. This makes it seem less like a population control issue or a keep babies alive issue, and more of a keep disempowered people in their place kind of issue. I was aware of some of these controversies prior to starting my PhD in sustainability engineering, but I didn't understand how long people have tried to control others' reproductive choices. I couldn't fully picture how this history impacted my daily life, even under the protection of Roe v. Wade. Though I grew up in a poor rural town that leaned a little too much into abstinence-only sex education, I still believed I had autonomy over my body. I could choose when I had a baby. I assumed, perhaps unfairly, that all those teenage girls around me having babies were simply making poor choices. My hometown was rumored to have one of the highest teenage pregnancy rates per capita in Wisconsin at the time. I likewise assumed that those older women undergoing treatment like IVF had made similarly poor choices. They just waited too long to decide to have a baby. The empathy I never wanted to develop. The longer I live on this planet, the more I realize how complicated life can be. What has been my experience of the world is most certainly not everyone's. Those girls in high school may not have had choices. Those women seeking IVF, likewise, may not have been waiting to make a decision. Regardless of their choices or the situations they find themselves in, none of them deserve to be shamed or turned away from care because they are all human. The hard reality for me is that the messaging from my community, my church, my family and friends, etc., deeply ingrained in me an urge to punish or shame these people and their poor choices. So yes, my knee-jerk reaction to this IVF team was to question the need for IVF in the first place. Some lessons, however, you have to learn the hard way. I said I'd participate in the IVF greening event because I agreed with their logic. People are going to do IVF as long as it is available. We might as well improve its footprint as much as we can. After all, there are plenty of necessary medical interventions which can become unnecessary. Cesarean section births and hysterectomy being chief amongst those scrutinized. Interesting that these are all women's procedures. Between when I said yes and when I typed out this post, I suffered 2 miscarriages. Each pregnancy went to about 8 weeks gestation. With each, I had a first ultrasound where I could see a tiny blob and a whirring heart. With each, I had a second ultrasound where they couldn't find anything. My womb was just full of dead tissue. I was fortunate enough to be in a U.S. state where if doctors don't find a heartbeat, you can still take the abortion medications. Though I was warned the pharmacist might ridicule or criticize me for picking up these drugs. I wish he had, because I really wanted to fight someone, anyone, rather than deal with my grief. Unfortunately for me, and fortunately for the pharmacist, I received the drugs without any issues. The miscarriages themselves were not easy. The first time around, the medications did not work completely. It took 2 hysteroscopies, procedures where I was knocked unconscious and my insides scraped out, and 3 months of constant bleeding before all the products of conception were removed, and I could resume trying to have a baby. During the second miscarriage, we didn't bother with the meds and went straight to a hysteroscopy. We'll see if there's a third time. It is a very odd grief that hits you with a miscarriage. I'm fortunate that mine happened early in pregnancy. I had only gone through 4 weeks of nausea, exhaustion, and mind fog before my pregnancies ended. I was only just starting to get excited about the possibility of a new baby and what it would mean for my family. I was just starting to tell people, even though I know society tells you not to mention it to a soul until you are at least 10 weeks along. I suspect this is because no one values a woman's experience of anything, let alone the suffering that often accompanies the first trimester of pregnancy and possible pregnancy loss. The fluttering, fearful excitement that accompanies a positive pregnancy test, the expectations and hopes of what this drastically different future might be like, I do want to hold on to that again. My doctors have loosely floated IVF as a possibility for us. We know there was a genetic abnormality with a second miscarriage, and IVF would allow us to implant an embryo without extra chromosomes. When I said yes to helping this IVF group, I never would have thought I could relate to the work they do in helping people reach for their reproductive goals. Personally, I don't think I'd want to go through IVF, but suddenly, acutely, I understand why people would do it. The empathy we all should have in our climate journeys. Everyone everywhere is at a different part in their sustainability journey. Some don't even know they're on the journey yet. Everyone has their own way of thinking about things and seeing the world. Everyone everywhere has gone through different things in their past that shape who they are and what they value. These different perspectives are essential to shaping a new human world built on sustainability. We have to listen to the voices and experiences that weren't there when our policies and cultures were made the first time around, if we ever hope to build new policies and cultures that we can sustain into the future. Reproductive history is littered with such examples. Population policies have amplified the suffering and despair of many, especially when those people were not invited to help create the policy. We need to stop repeating these injustices. I still find myself getting very judgy when I see a family with more than 3 children. I have to stop my internal dialogue and breathe, reminding myself that, thankfully, not everyone holds the same interests and values that I do. While these parents or caretakers are likely busier than I am, they are probably also still very interested in a livable future for their children. I refuse to use my environmental values as the excuse for my biases, bigotry, and prejudices, so I work hard to question my beliefs and my gut reactions. The longer I live, the more convinced I am that there is no right and no wrong, no good and bad. I firmly believe that most of us are just trying our best with what we know and what we have. There can be better and worse, but nothing we do and nothing we have is inherently right or wrong, especially when it comes to individual decision-making. Life can be pretty tough, environmental concerns aside, and my advice for true individual climate action is to wrestle with your own inner biases and start opening your mind to the experience of others. Thank you for listening. If you want to embrace the adventure of climate action, subscribe to our podcast and check out our Love and Guilt in the Anthropocene blog at clinicallysustainable.substack.com.